All right, thank you everybody and welcome. I'm Julia Wiesenberg. I'm the Executive Director of Buckeye Book Fair, and I'll be facilitating our program tonight. Buckeye Book Fair is a nonprofit organization that promotes Ohio authors and Ohio literacy projects. Every November, we feature 100 Ohio authors in our annual book fair. Tonight, we have in store for us a fascinating discussion about the Underground Railroad movement and Ohio's crucial role. The format this evening is we will have about 30 minutes of a lecture from our author, Dr. Nancy Stearns Tice, and then 30 minutes for discussion and questions. Tonight, Nancy will be talking about the topic of her book, A Tour on the Underground Railroad Along the Ohio River. Nancy is a native of Oldham County, Kentucky, where she currently serves as the Executive Director of the Oldham County Historical Society. The Historical Society is based on a campus that includes the J.C. Barnett Libraries and Archives, which houses the area's information about slavery and the Underground Railroad. The National Park Service has designated the archive as a vital link to the Underground Railroad. Nancy has degrees in education, biology, and environmental studies, earning her PhD at the University of Louisville. During tonight's program, please feel free to use the chat feature to submit any questions, and we will save plenty of time for our discussion. We will be recording today's program so it can be viewed later, but we will protect your privacy if you turn on your video. You can also leave your video off or use the chat feature if you prefer. To use chat during the program, hit the escape key to exit the full screen mode and click on the chat icon to enter your question into the window that appears. We would like to thank our sponsor for tonight's program, Ohio Humanities, whose mission is to provide educational humanities programs to all Ohioans. This series of Ohio Book Talks presents author-led discussions of new books covering different periods in Ohio history. Now, I'm pleased to turn things over to author Nancy Stearns Tice to talk to us about the Underground Railroad in Ohio.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so happy to be here. I'm excited because we're going to take a little tour in our seats on this book that came out last February. I do want to thank the organization. I was moderated a panel discussion a few months ago, and it was really fun. And I feel really privileged to be here tonight to talk about my book. So I'm going to put up our share screen here. And I've got this on PowerPoint because if we're going to go on a tour, I want it to be visual. And you'll get to see some of the places, and hopefully you'll get to visit these places along the Ohio River. So this book was written to take people off the beaten path. I think it's really important to visit places to get an idea of what things were like when we talk about historic places. I think you get a better sense of place and a better sense of the surroundings and what really happened there. It was a time when people, in this particular history, people were defining and fighting for their rights. They were defining democracy. As you know, both women and people who were enslaved, Native Americans, a lot of people were not included in the Constitution. So experiencing these places kind of gives a reality to the difficulty of this journey to freedom. Trying to go to the next one. There we go. In 2004, I started my job at the Oldham County History Center. Our campus includes the Barnett Archives and Library. That's the building you're looking at. We're a regional museum. We have an education building, a root cellar, barn, and garden. The archives, when I started there, I discovered all of these family papers and county records, many of which were slave papers. And even though I grew up here, I really had never had heard that discussion growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and actually all the way till I got my job. So about 2004, I started, came across Henry Bibb right off the bat. We'll talk about him. And because of that, we started this archaeology program in 2007 on a Gatewood site. We began our research on the Underground Railroad and Henry Bibb's life. Our archives are the original home of James and Amanda Mount. The Mounts were slaveholders. James was a local jailer. We have their family papers, very rare papers, which include transfers, bounty hunter, and ownership documents. Our research located the original plantation of William Gatewood. He was one of the first justice of peace in Oldham County. He was a slaveholder of slave abolitionist and Underground Railroad conductor Henry Bibb. We began an archaeology program there on the site with the direction of the archaeologists Janine Kreinbrick and Doug von Stroh. Both Janine and Doug are from the northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area. Henry Bibb was a pretty amazing man, particularly for someone I never heard of until I started working here. His birth date, 1815 to 1854. He was the son of Mildred Jackson, a slave, and James Bibb, but he never met his father. He was born in Henry County and had 6 brothers, and they were separated and sold away. He was hired out as a little boy, and his wages paid for the education of Harriet White, who was his playmate and the person that enslaved him, his owner. Henry married another slave, Melinda, and they had a little girl, Mary Frances. His last enslavement in Kentucky was by William Gatewood, where he and his wife and daughter lived. In 1836 was Henry's first attempt to escape. He met conductors in Madison, Indiana, and jumped on a steamboat to Cincinnati and learned about the Underground Railroad. He spent the winter in Perrysburg, Ohio, where he worked and saved money. He returned to get his wife and daughter, but he was captured, and Gatewood sold him to a slave trader, Matthew Garrison, in Louisville. Bibb describes the horrendous conditions of the slave jails in Louisville in his narratives. He and his family were then sent to the New Orleans slave markets. His family was purchased by a slaveholder, Deacon Whitfield of the Claiborne Parish in Louisiana. Bibb suffered unspeakable beatings and was separated from his wife and daughter, never to see them again. Eventually, he made it to free soil. He lectured with Frederick Douglass, and he wrote his narratives, which he sold. And with those narratives and the money from the narratives, and when he was on the abolition circuit speaking, he raised enough money to purchase land in Canada, where he had a refugee colony for fugitive slaves. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. In 2016, the National Park Service awarded the History Center 2 sites on the National Underground Railroad network. The Bibb Escapes Gatewood Plantation Archaeology Site. We just had a dig there last weekend. And the Barnett Library and Archives at the History Center, where the Mount family records are and where we have a lot of court documents. In September 2018, I decided it would be interesting to conduct a bus tour on the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River because I felt there was a lot of potential and so much research had taken place on these sites due to the National Park Service when they formed the National Underground Railroad Network in the last 20 years. So we sponsored a bus tour. It was a great success. We started at the History Center. We crossed Ohio River, went to Madison, Indiana, on through Cincinnati, Ripley, Ohio, and then Maysville in Kentucky, and followed that to the Old Paris Pike to Lexington, and then down to Camp Nelson. I felt that what I learned would be excellent material for a book where individuals could go on their own and discover these incredible freedom seekers, conductors, and places along the river where people often sacrifice their own safety and lives for others. The main features of the Underground Railroad as defined by the National Park Service are this. Number one, any place where an enslaved person journeyed to freedom, it can start with an escape site, a place of refuge, a trail, etc. So in the case of the Mount House here at the History Center, we actually have bounty hunter documents that show that 2 slaves escaped to join the Union, and these bounty hunter documents. So this Mount House would be the first step toward their journey. So that's why it would be on the site. Number 2, the movement was started by African Americans with assistance from free blacks, institutions of higher learning. There were colleges involved, religious groups, activists, etc. Number three, it became more organized as the media increased. The small printing press was invented by the 1830s, 1840s. People were able to buy these presses and start their own newspapers. So you started having a lot of papers that on anti-slavery sentiments. Slave narratives. Henry Bibb was just one of over 100 slave narratives written by people who had escaped or had tried to escape themselves prior to 1860. There was also, it became more organized because during this same period along the Ohio River, there was an increase of steamboat traffic. And I mean, hundreds and hundreds of steamboats going up and down the Ohio River, which gave great opportunity for people on the slave soil, Kentucky, which is 664 miles, to the free soil, which would be Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Railroads were also used for escapes, as well as the canals. The canals were being built at the same time that the railroads were developed. And they actually, what these canals did was, you know, it was sort of a highway you could follow going north to Lake Erie. So the Kentucky border, 664 miles along the river, provided this tremendous amount of opportunity for people to cross over. You have to remember that picture you're seeing is the Ohio River today, but 100 and 200 years ago, it was half that size. Sometimes in the winter, it would freeze completely over. Sometimes in the summer, places like Madison, where there was a shallow area, people could almost wade across. So when you start to pick up this book, it's organized from west to east, but you can go either way. You can pick a day or two or take several weeks. But this shows you from Evansville to Maysville what the book area that it covers. So I don't go into central and northern Ohio that much. I stayed along the Ohio River because the Ohio River was such a significant crossing for so many people. So if we start at Evansville and Owensboro, that part of Illinois and Kentucky, that's closer to Missouri, and it's closer to where the Ohio River empties, of course, into the Mississippi. And these areas were harder for slave escapes because you're so close, you know, down to Missouri. And there's stories where, you know, people, slave catchers would come up and try to get people who lived in Illinois. There is still a house standing there in Evansville. It's the Willard Carpenter House. He was an industrialist. He abhorred slavery, and he was known to in documented cases of him assisting people that were coming across the river. Another amazing thing to me is this man, Josiah Henson. There is a trail there in Owensboro. It's not really well marked, but it's about 18 miles west of Owensboro. He was the real Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he has been downplayed over the years as someone, is sort of a bad stigma of Black, but the truth be told, he was extremely brave, and he and his family escaped, and he ended up being a conductor on the Underground Railroad, raising money for schools in Canada. And he became very famous. He even went to England to meet the Queen that wanted to hear his narrative. He wrote his narrative. Now, when I keep talking about narratives, these people that I'm talking about, most of them, if you just go to the internet and Google their names, you'll get their narratives. They're usually free. UNC Charlotte does a great job of providing these narratives of people. So here we have, along the Ohio River at this time, and this is along the Kentucky border, we have mainly two major ports that were happening. You have the Louisville, that's Louisville Waterfront on your left, and then you can recognize the Roebling Bridge, a later document, but Cincinnati. So that's the Cincinnati Waterfront. Completely different, of course, than what we see today. And the river it doesn't look too much different in the width right there on Cincinnati. So you have Louisville as the slave trading town, and you have Cincinnati as a city of hope for many people. Louisville was a center of slave trading because there were numerous slave jails. That's a picture of the prison in Louisville. If what happened, the system worked where people would go out, slave traders, or they'd send people out and they go to local jails. Like here where my office is across the street, James Mount was a jailer. And the job of the jailer was to capture or house an escaped slave that was caught by bounty hunters or whatever reason. And then they would be auctioned in front of the courthouse door, or sometimes James Mount himself would purchase a slave if he got a person for a good price. And then, or he would also hold them for slave traders that could come around and bargain and take the people who were enslaved back to the Louisville jails where they would have auctions, or they would load them on boats and send them on down south to work in various agricultural, hemp, cotton, whatever. So across, that's a KFC Yum Center where the University of Louisville Cardinals play basketball. It's right down on Main Street in Louisville. You can see there's a marker there. That Main Street area in Louisville was very, very active for slave auctions. So at that time in Louisville, in 1840, there were 26,987 whites, there were 763 free blacks, and 8,596 enslaved people. That's just in the Louisville area. So these people who were free, there's two names that really stand out. First of all, W.H. Gibson wrote down his observations after the Civil War of how they would help people get through the system and onto free soil. And then there was Washington Spradling, who, that's his marker in the Louisville Cemetery. It's a beautiful marker. So people worked mainly within their churches as well. There was about 5 or 6 churches, African-American churches, often formed with the permission of the white churches there. But these often became places where people could escape. And a lot of slaveholders liked for their laborers to go to church because they thought it as a benevolent Christian thing to do. So one thing that really blew my mind to get an idea of what was actually going on, you'll see this want ad that I pulled out of the Louisville Free Public Library from the Louisville Daily Democrat. This is June 30th, 1860. These are actual want ads from these slave traders. And this thing that strikes me, which I'm sure it might strike you as well, is the numbers. 300 Negroes wanted. I have leased the house on 6th Street between Main and Market for a term of years. It's known as a pal house. I wish to purchase Negroes of both sexes, which I will pay the highest cash prices. I mean, it's disgusting, and it's like a wanted, ad for livestock. It's the same kind of thing. It's shocking. And, we never see this. I mean, until lately, when more research started coming about with the Underground Railroad, this is something you didn't see. Washington Spradling was a developer, and he and his brother, they had a barber shop too. His brother ended up leaving Louisville and going to Cincinnati and working on the Underground Railroad with Levi and Catherine Coffin and some other people. And Spradling, his interview is also available. You can find it online. I have a good bibliography in the back of the book where he talks about what it was like being black in Louisville and how his children, he would always fear that they should never leave Louisville because they could be captured and sold as slaves and all that. So the church, here you see the Green Street Baptist Church on the left, which was organized in 1844. That church is not that old. It's been built again. That church also, which is interesting, is the last place where Martin Luther King spoke in Louisville. His brother was a minister at the Zion Baptist Church in Louisville, so Martin Luther King visited here often. But this site was the last place that he talked in Louisville before he was killed. And the Green Street Baptist Church has always been fairly active in the civil rights movement. And then across the road, across the river, you have New Albany, Indiana. This church, they have some beautiful sculptures behind it that you can go and look. It was known as a place on the Underground Railroad. And there, of course, you have a lot of free blacks there and whatnot. Other places to look for about life during this period, the Farmington family, that was a Speed family home. Abraham Lincoln visited there. He was good sons with their friend. It's interesting, they had about 30 or so enslaved laborers, and they had 30 acres of flax. And what the flax was used for was cotton bags. It was used for bags, hemp bags, and whatnot, as well for to hold cotton. So the flax goes into linen. And then Locust Grove is another good place to visit. They have a cabin that's on display. The York statue at the Belvedere, that's right by the Muhammad Ali Museum, which is a great place to go for looking at not just slavery, but just the whole civil rights movement, of course. Kids can interact. That's my grandson pointing to Muhammad Ali. And then the other interesting thing was that a lot of the people who were fleeing, like the men who went to enlist at into the Union, there was a camp known as Camp Nelson, where roughly 10,000 African men enlisted. And this was like a free soil spot. If you enlisted in the Union during this time, you could become free. Kentucky had roughly 24,000 African American soldiers who fought in the Civil War, fought for the Union, making us one of the largest, if not the largest, state that produced black soldiers that fought in the Union. And over to the left, you'll see a grave of Rufus Holt, who was a Union soldier. He's buried here in the Grange. These are some of the people: George Baptiste, Elijah Anderson, Laura Havlin, Delia Webster, Calvin Fairbank. These are just a few of the people that were conductors on the Underground Railroad. You never hear of these names. So, we have people that we're more familiar with that we celebrate, but there were so many people who were part of this movement that we should recognize. The woman on the right, for instance, she portrays, that's Erica Wardlow. She's here at the History Center. She portrays Delia Webster, fascinating woman that had a farm across from Madison, Indiana. And Madison is amazing in that, of course, this is a free district here for blacks. This is a neighborhood they call the Georgetown district, where there were several hundreds leading after the Civil War that lived there. But there were some very famous people. The George Baptiste is a free black who settled for a time in the Georgetown district and was a known conductor. And he was so threatened, he later moved to Detroit. But what I found out in my research is he and Henry Bibb became good friends. And when Henry Bibb went to Madison in 1836, he more than likely hooked up with George Baptiste because they become friends and together work as conductors, as George Baptiste helps people from Detroit across the river to where Henry Bibb would wait for fugitives. And the Eleutherian College is right outside of Madison. This was a group of people, anti-slavery society, that lived there in that community and set up this college that was education for girls and boys, blacks and whites. Pretty incredible place. As you move up the river, then you come on to the Cincinnati area. And the Cincinnati Freedom Center is a great place to visit. What you see on the left is the Captain John Anderson slave jail. And that slave jail was transported from Germantown in Kentucky to be the centerpiece exhibit at the Freedom Center in Cincinnati. The Freedom Center sits between the Red Stadium and the Bingle Stadium now. And this jail was where Anderson would go around, just like I said a while ago, and go around to farmers and whatnot to see if there were any people that he could buy. He would take them to this barn which they were chained to, and he would wait until there was enough shipment, 10 or 12 people or so, that would be profitable enough for him to put them on a boat and send them on down to the South and the Southern slave markets. So they've done a lot of work. Janine Kreinberg, who we work with, she was responsible for overseeing this archaeological project outside Maysville, which they brought to Cincinnati for the centerpiece exhibit there. The woman on your right, that is the Margaret Garner and her family depicted on the wall. It was a beautiful mural, series of murals that have been done there to depict the Ohio River. And here she is crossing the frozen Ohio River from Covington to Cincinnati. Now, she's famous and sort of immortalized in Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, because when they get over to what they think is safety in a house, they are caught. People cross the river, bounty hunters, and she slit the throats of her children. Her 2-year-old daughter died, but the other 3 survived. Anyway, that story is, again, something that you can find on the internet to find more information about Margaret. Harriet Beecher Stowe, that's her family house to the left. It's a great house museum they have there. She, of course, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which influenced mainstream America's opinion about slavery at that time. Her father, Lyman Beecher, brought his family to Cincinnati from Connecticut to a teaching job at this Lane Seminary, which is no longer there, but it was a seminary which was liberal arts, and they had all kinds of interesting discussion on slavery. In fact, some of the debates were so controversial, many of the students became passionate abolitionists, and without permission of the trustees of the seminary, formed their own school to teach blacks to read. That was not well met with the trustees of Lane Seminary, so 32 of those students were asked to leave, and they went to Oberlin College in Ohio, which was a known college that trained conductors on the Underground Railroad. What I didn't know, again, hearing about Uncle Tom's Cabin my whole life, I didn't know that most of her characters are actually based on real people, and a lot of them Kentuckians. They're based on people like Levi and Catherine Coffin, Josiah Henson, who I talked about a while ago, Eliza Harris, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Stowe and her husband, who was a professor at Lane Seminary, they were both Underground Railroad conductors. Stowe was also friends with the Quakers Levi and Catherine Coffin. Now, Levi Coffin, he said himself that he helped or assisted at least 3,000 people on the Underground Railroad, none of which were ever captured. He started out in Indiana, he and Catherine, and then as the Underground Railroad really began to catch more and more steam, they decided Cincinnati would be a better crossover place because there was so much activity, river activity. They could actually ferry people from boats from places like Louisville. They would go down and assist people in Louisville. They would put them on the boat, and then they would take them all the way up to Cincinnati. There's many stories about different people who escaped that way. They owned several warehouses. In fact, they tried to do a free trade warehouse to demonstrate that you could make money on free trade. They had a society, Cincinnati Sewing Society, Catherine headed up, where they would make disguises for people who escaped from the Underground Railroad. The major thing here was to get people out of Cincinnati as quick as possible because it was very dangerous. Bounty hunters could easily cross into Cincinnati, just like they did in the Margaret Garner case. So anyway, that's a great visit place. And if you see to the right, the Cincinnati Museum Center, one of my favorite museums. It took them years, 5, 6, 7 years to open, but it's just an amazing museum. And they opened up this exhibit about the riverfront in Cincinnati during this time of the Underground Railroad. They don't address the Underground Railroad a lot in the exhibit, but you get the feel of what it was like and the river was like at the time, the stores and all that. I take my grandkids there, and they love that exhibit. They also have some great dinosaurs. They have a children's center. You need to make a stop there as well. And then if you go Antebellum across to Covington, right by the Roebling Bridge, again, that bridge that looks just like, the Brooklyn Bridge, made by the same people, designed by the same people. There's the Riverside Drive, and all these antebellum homes are located. People are very proud of their houses. It's a beautiful walk. It's not even that long. They have statues along the way. That's James Bradley, who was the only Black at the time and attended Lane Seminary. He had a wonderful career, and then that's well worth a visit. And then Findlay Market, which is another great place to go in Cincinnati, was actually an escape route. Again, it was a place. Findlay Market's been there, pre-Civil War, and you could, if you were a fugitive, you were trying to get through as many places where there are lots of people, and that was a great place to, run through as you go up to College Hill. So we keep on going up the river on this book. Now we're on the Kentucky side. That picture on the left is the oldest jail in Kentucky. If you go up to it, this is in Augusta. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful little river town. In fact, George Clooney's parents live there. This is a home of Heather French Henry. And if you stay at a bed and breakfast there, Jenny's Bed and Breakfast, she has framed Heather French Henry's shoe when she won the Miss America contest. All these kind of fun things, of course, when you are touring your side trips. So that jail, if you look inside it, there's another jail inside of it, which is where they would have kept people who were enslaved, chained, dark areas. It's also the only place where you can still cross the ferry. It runs almost 24 hours. I think it shuts down at 10 or 11 and it opens up again at 6. So it's another great place to go. Augusta was a site of a Civil War, a small Civil War skirmish. People in Augusta were very strong abolitionists. This is where you see Reverend Gregory Fee, who became a staunch abolitionist in Kentucky and involved in the Underground Railroad. Between Augusta on the Kentucky side and Maysville on the Kentucky side, you see across the river Ripley, Ohio. That was a famous hotbed of abolitionism led by two very important men, John Rankin and John Parker. The little house on top of the hill, that's John Rankin. He said he assisted thousands of people, ferried them through the Underground Railroad as a conductor. And then the house on the right is John Parker's house. He was a slave who bought his freedom from work in a foundry in Alabama, so he learned to work foundries. He moved to New Albany, Indiana, then Cincinnati, and he went on to Ripley, where he operated his foundry and became a conductor. He has also holds several patents on inventions. I think it was a tobacco press he invented. All his kids, keep in mind that these conductors usually had large families. John Rankin had 12 or 13 kids. John Parker had 6 or 7. The kids were also involved in helping people cross the Underground Railroad. So Parker wrote his autobiography too, again, which you can find online. And he said he assisted, that he counted 440 fugitives on their way north. John Rankin would put a light in his window, and it became a beacon for people who were trying to escape. You could see the lights at night in the house. He just kept them burning all the time to make it on top of the hill. When you go to the Freedom Center, they talk about the town of Ripley. They have a wonderful, wonderful little movie that's narrated by Oprah Winfrey. And she gives the whole, it's just a great story about the Rankin house. You've got to see it. It's set on the Ohio River. It's really fun. So Maysville was very interesting because it's right on the river, and it sort of is the middle. There was a Paris Turnpike that went into the central Bluegrass, Lexington, into the slave cells. A lot of activity happened in Maysville. There's a lot of things to see. On the left, you see a monument to Elijah Green, a man who purchased his freedom And then he planted black churches in Maysville and Paris, Kentucky. He gave a lot of opportunities for blacks to congregate, become educated. That's a little diorama at the Kentucky Gateway Museum in Maysville. And story aside, they also have one of the most amazing miniature house collections in the United States at the Gateway Museum. So great places there to visit. So as you go along the trails and you're taking your kids or just you and friends or whatever, there's great places. Uh, the the talk about slavery is a hard talk, and when you're taking kids through, like I do my grandchildren, it's nice to have breather spots. And one of the things that I noticed when I was going up and down the river, people have taken a lot of pride. This is Strother's Park in Owensboro, great place for the kids to get out and play. You know, there's good barbecue in Owensboro. Um, I love this little canal. It's an operating canal in Metamora, Indiana, right outside of Cincinnati, not too far. And it still operates, and it gives you an idea of what the canal system was like. You know, the canal system wasn't very long lived because they kind of forgot that the canals, the water would freeze in the winter. So the railroads sort of beat out the canals for taking goods and services up north. The scenic views are incredible. This is a view from Clifty Falls State Park, where you can see, if you see that bridge to this side of Kentucky. Kentucky's over on the other side of the river. That's close to where the Delia Webster farm was. She got in so much trouble. She was jailed in Kentucky, the first white woman that we know of. People are always saying the first woman jailed in Kentucky Penitentiary. Well, that's not true. She would have been the first white woman. I'm sure there were many black women as slaves who were in jails before she was. But anyway, she was educated at Oberlin College, and she got caught on her first attempt with a man named Calvin Anderson in Lexington, helping the Lewis Hayden family escape to up through Maysville. And the escape was successful. In fact, Lewis Hayden and his wife end up in the Boston area, and he becomes this legislator. His child, his only son, died in the as a Union soldier. Also, you can see President Grant's birthplace at Point Pleasant, Ohio, on this trip as you're coming down the road. So, in order to get people even more engrossed in the Underground Railroad, we developed a podcast. I took the Underground Railroad book that came out in February, and because of COVID, we launched the idea of 30 days of stories on the Underground Railroad, and we asked people to participate, volunteer recruits. I just put it on the internet. So many people from all over the United States, authors, museum directors, families, researchers, graduate students. That's Christine Harleb, she's the executive director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. Robert Bell in the plaid shirt. He just completed his fellowship here at the Oldham County History Center and who has researched over 200 black soldiers from our county who enlisted for the Union. All of these people are just, Regina Lang on the right-hand corner has her own tour business outside of Maysville now. Her grandfather is the one who told people about the slave jail that ended up in Cincinnati. So you can go to the 30 Days of Stories, Oldham Podcast Network, and pick up this and listen to their stories. It's a great activity for classrooms or whatever. Some really moving stories people read. We declared September Underground Railroad Month in Kentucky last year. Those are graves of Union soldiers, black soldiers from Camp Nelson, just to give you an idea of the immensity of what we're talking about here. And there's more contact information for me, and that's it. So I'm going to put the screen down and through. So I guess we could take questions or whatever.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a great presentation. I really appreciate that we learned.
How people felt like they went on a trip.
It is a
trip.
trip.
You're tired, you need to take a drink, get out and stretch, go to the bathroom. You can do it all in the comfort of your house.
That was great. And I do have some questions. I know people maybe are thinking about some questions, we encourage you to put those in the chat. One of the questions that I know we all are interested in here is why Ohio was so crucial to the Underground Railroad movement.
Well, first of all, there's been a tremendous amount of research in Ohio that have identified the Underground Railroads. If you go to New Richmond, they've documented like 19 sites. That's right beside Cincinnati. And you can go there and follow the trail that they have established there. Ohio was important because there were a whole lot of abolitionist groups like Oberlin College, for instance. I mean, Oberlin just stands out. If you've never been to Oberlin College, it's worth a visit. They have a whole lot of information. A lot of anti-slavery groups were there. That whole town of Ripley was settled by a man who abhorred slavery, and as a result, other people moved in there. So there was a lot of branches. And then again, branches that went on and led people north. And then again, if you go to Cincinnati, you know, it was such a big city that people felt like they could get through Cincinnati maybe better than a small town. You know, many thousands of people never were assisted by a lot of people on the Underground Railroad. They might have had a few hints there, but you know, there's a lot of people that just made it through on their own. So Ohio is sort of the central, to me, it's probably one of the most important places. Its location in its position in Kentucky, you know, was really essential.
Right. Thank you so much for that. It's interesting, just the geography of it makes such a difference. We have some interesting questions coming in, so I'll move on to some of those if you're ready.
Sure.
This one is from one of our attendees tonight. He's researching an individual in Findlay, Ohio, who was active in the Underground Railroad, and he was listed as the treasurer of the Underground Railroad in Findlay. Did the Underground Railroad provide financial aid to the fleeing slave people? Was this common?
So the Underground Railroad, there wasn't an organization called the Underground Railroad. It was anti-slavery groups that met with churches, the American Missionary Association. They worked together like Oberlin. So a lot of times, for instance, I talked about Catherine and Levi Coffin. They had a great association with a man named Calvin Fairbank, who was kind of a renegade. He would go in, he spent 17 years in Kentucky prisons for assisting people. He was with Delia Webster. So for instance, he would go out to these slave auction sites in Kentucky. And if there was someone that they were trying, maybe a family member said to the Coffins, you know, can you please do this or that? And the auction site was up, they would actually give him money to go and purchase that person, you know, and then bring them back. So sometimes that happened. Other times, like Delia Webster, you know, I said she was in jail for assisting Lewis Hayden. When she got out of jail, she went on back home, and which was up in the Northeast, and she contacted other people, and people gave her money to buy this farm across from Madison, Indiana. So it wasn't like it was people giving each other money for different causes. The American Missionary Association, they raised money. That was a very interesting association because it was formed by blacks and whites at the time. And what they did was supplied Bibles to people in Kentucky into the fields, but they also were giving literature to people working in the fields on how they could escape, or if they couldn't read, they would pass along information. They were called poll tortures. So, you know, it was not any one thing that I can think of. Most everything that I saw in assistance, people were helping. They would give individual money, or there'd be some people who were wealthy that would contribute.
Thank you for that. I found that to be something really interesting in your book, pointing out how active the Underground Railroad movement was, as opposed to just safe houses along the way, but people were very actively participating.
Yeah, the anti-slavery societies, they started forming all over the place, and so they had conventions. You know, I talked about Henry Bibb and Frederick Douglass on a speaker's circuit. They were on a speaker's circuit that went to Detroit and Boston and New York City. And they would hold these conventions and conferences and talk about, human rights and what it's like to be enslaved. So it was, and then the newspapers, remember the newspapers come out. Lloyd Garrison, there's several newspapers that were so important. The Philanthropist was Garrison's, I believe. Henry Bibb, he became the first black editor of a newspaper in Canada. He started his own press called the Voice of the Fugitive. James Burney in Cincinnati, he started out in Richmond. They tried to burn his press. Each story, there was a man that owned the press up in Illinois. Let's see, what was his name? He actually was killed. People rioted, came into his press, and they killed him. Who was that man? I believe he was in Illinois. And Henry Press's, his, yeah, Elijah Lovejoy. His press was burned and he was shot to death by a mob in Illinois. So these were major risks, the people were taking.
And when you say that, I do wonder, the risk to people, was being involved in this movement something that was a lifelong commitment, or was it very risky? Was it often a short-term commitment that people were making, or did it vary?
People were passionate, like you see. It's not any different than today, how people are passionate on the Black Lives Matter movement. You have people that actually go to the protests and stand out and shout, while you have other people that are watching from your television that may support it. When the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act was passed, federal law, it allowed for people to cross the Ohio River, bounty hunters, slave owners, to go get the person that's run away. And they might have some idea where that person is. And some of the people who had run away were living comfortably in communities scattered all around. So all at once, these people who had been accepted in the community were being drug out of their homes. And now people were witnessing slavery in their own backyard. They were starting to see the brutality of families being split apart, and it enraged people. So the 1850 Fugitive Act made people who were fleeing slavery go farther north into Canada. That's why so many people started really pushing to Canada, because for the first time the law allowed bounty hunters to cross the border of the river to go get people. And so it became much more different. So, people were in and out of the movement, but there's some people that just stand out, that just risk their life no matter what on a day-to-day basis. Eliza Harris is a great example. In the Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe used this woman, Eliza, who escaped, and this is in the Maysville area, with a son and her boyfriend, I think. It's her boyfriend or husband. Anyway, she left her 2-year-old behind. She couldn't get the baby at that time. So she goes back and gets the baby on her own by herself. And it's in the dead of winter. And she's running and she comes to the edge of the river and she sees a cabin and this man takes her in. It's a white man. And obviously would feel sorry for her and gives her warmth and comfort. She wakes up to the sound of hounds. So the man actually turned her in, and the slave catchers and their dogs were coming after her. So she runs out of the cabin, goes to the river, and the river's half frozen. And she takes that babe in a pole, and she makes her way across the river. And there's a man, a slave catcher, across and sees her, and he feels so sorry for her. He says, anybody that can do that deserves their freedom, and he helps her to the John Rankin house. That's a true story. She later makes it to Canada, her whole family. Those kind of stories are everywhere. I've got wonderful books. There's one, Anne Hagedorn books, Beyond the River is great. These are some of the readers on those podcasts I'm talking about too. The Grapevine Dispatch, Carolyn Miller's book. She does some wonderful stuff. And she has great documented stories of slave escapes up and down the river, going over to Ohio. There were so many communities in Ohio, from Quakers to slave societies, free Black communities that were assisting people.
Thank you. I was just going to add that one to the chat. That's something that I had noticed, especially in your book, how much richness there is in original sources. And I have a couple questions here. And in the general sense of the question, how do you know where these Underground Railroad sites are? And because there is such a wealth of information out there, why so much legend about this?
Yeah, and that really didn't come about to the last. Really, the National Park Service, I think, established the National Underground Railroad Network and encouraged more authors and research in that subject. And there's just been a plethora of sites now that are identified and recognized through the network. But the story of the Underground Railroad to me was hidden. I think after the Civil War, all of these people had been speaking out. All of these people had written their stories. Uh, in the South, there was still frustration. There was a lot of lynchings of blacks. There was a lot of horrible things that were happening. And I think that some of this history, it was too encouraging. It gave too much empathy to the civil rights movement for a lot of people. They didn't want this history to come alive because there was a lot of organization after the Civil War uh, between blacks and whites to make things better, and then it just sort of disappears. I don't know why this story of the Underground Railroad, to me, which is one of the more rich and important stories of American democracy, weren't talked about from early on. Um, Harriet Tubman, we hear about the Frederick Douglasses and the Harriet Tubmans, but there was just an incredible amount of people, and they knew each other. That's one of the things that I found out is these people worked together. Uh, uh, Delia Webster worked with the Coffins. The Coffins worked with Calvin Fairbank. Harry Beecher Stowe met all of these people. Salmon Chase, an attorney in Cincinnati, the Chase Law School, he was very involved and would represent people, often would represent fugitives from Cincinnati. Of course, he became a Supreme Court justice later. Uh, you know, so there was a lot of people that did not like uh, slavery in the United States. You can look back and look at the debates of all of that. But I don't know why all these myths occur, just like the Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Over the years, it was mimicked, and blacks didn't like to think about being an Uncle Tom, that you were subservient to people. I mean, you look at Josiah Henson's story; it's just this whole incredible, different story. Uh, I mean, he was truly a hero, Josiah Henson, and the figure of Uncle Tom. So it's completely different, and there's a lot of debates. And I'm not right at all. I mean, the more that I did this tour, I just wanted people to get out and see these sites. I mean, we've researched Henry Bibb since 2005, and he's become a part of our story here. But there are so many others, good authors. I just listened. Nikki Taylor was on the Kentucky Humanities Council's talk not too long ago. She wrote a great book, Frontiers of Freedom, Cincinnati's Black Community. Uh, and she talked a lot about the Margaret Garner case, which is just so awful. It's hard to even, you have to get past uh, the brutality of the whole situation to understand it. And she talks a lot about Black feminism and slavery, and I mean, it's great. So she's another good author. But all these places are there. And if you look at the podcasts, great readers, some of these people are reading their own stories that they've researched.
Well, thank you. I appreciate so much scholarship. So we're going to tap into a little bit of yours. Hopefully, these aren't too tasking for you. So the question sort of on location, a little more focus in Ohio is, are there graveyards of importance that we can see today? And were there any other colleges besides Oberlin that were key in this movement?
Well, like I talked about Lane Seminary. So the book that I wrote is along the corridor of the Ohio River. Uh, that's what I was talking about. Nikki Taylor's book talks a lot about the Cincinnati, the Black community. Um, River Jordan, Joe Trotter's book, African Americans, Urban Life in the Ohio Valley. Um, I can tell you more about the graveyards on the Kentucky side. I am very, very impressed with the graveyard that in Indiana. Is it Spring Hill? Let's see, it's in the book. That's where the coffins are buried in Salmon Chase, and it goes back to that time. Some of the free black communities north of Ripley, there's still some small towns there. Um, I know that on the Kentucky side, we had, see, I can't really speak to that in Ohio because in Kentucky, the cemeteries were always segregated. And so up until probably 1960s or so. So I can speak to where those are as far as where slaves are buried. Most of the time, they are small rocks in the ground, you know, if you can find them. There's usually a cemetery associated with a black community. I know that our black community here in LaGrange has their own cemetery right up behind black community. Um, so here it was very segregated. I don't know about Ohio. Um, I know there's another African American cemetery in Lexington, but I can't speak for Ohio because, you know, on the slave end of it, I don't know what the cemetery situation is.
Well, thank you for taking a swing at that. It's nice to know that there are sites in Kentucky. You say that are they marked or are they ones that historians are aware of based on?
No, we definitely have, like we have the cemetery, historic African American cemetery in LaGrange. Uh, the best, really impressive military cemetery at Camp Nelson for all of those soldiers, U.S. colored troops, that all those people who fought during the Union are buried in that cemetery. Most every small town in Kentucky has segregated cemeteries, I'm sure. I would just bet on it, but I haven't been to all of them.
Well, thank you for great questions. I give people a little more time if they want to put any questions into the chat or unmute yourself and ask directly. We welcome that. We had a few questions come in from the internet, so I have a couple more I can ask, but I want to give everybody attending the opportunity to ask. I know um, there's a lot of questions about the history and the impact of this movement. One of the big questions along the lines of, you know, where do the legends come from if the information is there? A big question we have is how do people know if their house was an old house was part of the Underground Railroad?
Well, that's very difficult. Um, it needs to be documented in some way. So we know, for instance, and the coffin started out at Newport, Indiana, and I mean, we know that their house was because they were so vocal about it. And there's records that you can prove. I mean, and they talked about it and all that. I know that people here in my county say, well, this house was on the Underground Railroad. It's like, well, do you know, who owned the house originally? How can you prove that? You really can't prove it. I mean, it was, unless you have documentation that more than likely, I can say this, probably, more than likely on the Kentucky side, if you were a slaveholder, you probably were on the Underground Railroad because people were running away from your house, more than likely. But in Ohio, um, you know, a lot of Quaker societies and churches are well known, communities are well known and documented that they helped. Uh, I was talking about those. There was two or three black communities where a man from Virginia, the right north of Ripley, Ohio, people settled and they became very involved in helping people go north. People could hang out there and until they wanted to go on. National Park Services documented some people from the deep south. It took them years to get north. They would go a little distance, hang out at a big city. Then, if they felt that they could find the directions, go to the next big city.
Thank you. I I was looking to see, do we have any specific questions? The other one I know we have about specific sites in Ohio is the College Hill area in Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that Hamilton Avenue, there are a couple of small schools there and professors, and probably the most famous story, and again, you can Google this, and I have it in the book, is the escape of the 28. And that is an amazing story. There was a man, Van Sant. He was a gun for hire, so you could hire John Van Zant to go, and he would go in and get people and bring them back out. In this instance, he actually bought a group of 28 people from Boone County, Kentucky, across the river, and it was a very well uh, organized escape where they went through Cincinnati, and they had people meeting them on the way. And the last place was College Hill. Some of the people in College Hill were helping the coffins with the Ladies Sewing Society and some of the things they were doing on the waterfront. And so they have a couple of houses. It's not very well documented, except they have a brochure that you can download on the internet and use that brochure to go through. But the area has changed quite a bit, so it's hard to visit some of the specific spots that would have been on the Underground Railroad. The College Hill, Christine Hartlib at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House is a good one to go visit, and she's got that story down really well. But the escape of the 28 is probably one of the most famous stories, and all of them made it to Canada, all of them together. Uh, there was a baby that died that was smothered as they were crossing the river and went up to downtown Cincinnati. The baby died, but then someone else joined. But it was pretty much an intact group. And that's amazing if you think of trying to ferret 28 people from Boone County to Canada.
That really is astonishing. The stories you shared are wonderful tonight, so inspiring. And um, I'm not seeing anything else come in. I just want to give everybody another minute before we conclude tonight. I just want to ask one final question, and this is just an opportunity about, are there any myths about the Underground Railroad you'd like to dispel?
Well, most people think it is a railroad, people use the railroad. Also, people think it's underground, which it's just a term used to denote secrecy. It wasn't actually ever underground. Most people, when they were escaping, had to spend a lot of times outdoors, hiding under trees and bushes and caves and whatever. There's a lot of controversy. The woman who wrote the book about the quilts, hanging the quilts out to show directions. If you think about somebody that's running away and looking for a quilt hanging out a window would not be something, you would probably have time to do. So that's a sort of another one that's been out there. A lot of historians have debated that one. And I would be in the group that would say that would be quite difficult. Um, Also, that's a movement started. A lot of people think it was a Quakers movement. Quakers were involved, like the coffins, but really, it's a movement started by someone who's enslaved, it, organized by people who were enslaved, whose desperation and circumstances and bravery caught the attention of other people who believed that there shouldn't be this type of organization in the United States. So, it was. I guess that would be the main. And the other thing is people don't realize that we're free blacks in slave states. Like in Louisville, we had 800 free blacks. So those people were helping people who were enslaved. Some of the people, like W.H. Gibson, he was a free man who moved down to Louisville. I think he was from New York or somewhere up east. Some people came down here because they were passionate about helping, their brothers and sisters and friends, and just hearing about slavery and how awful it was. People say that if you were in Kentucky slave, you were better off than if you went south. It's another myth. We have equally awful stories about being enslaved in Kentucky. So, I'd say that takes care of most of them that people talk to me about.
Well, thank you. That's important to dispel the myths as well as celebrate, the truth and the triumphs of the movement. And I put back into the chat our web link so that you can learn more about Nancy and her work at the Oldham County Historical Society. Please visit their website. You can get information about the podcast that
For the-
she's done. And you can also visit the Buckeye Book Fair website if you'd like to get a copy of the book.
Yeah, and again, I'll send you a bibliography. And if you go to the podcast, the stories start out with Bob Bells, Camp Nelson, and Soldier Peter Bruner. And Robert Bell does a great job of reading Peter's life directly from what Peter wrote about being enslaved in Kentucky. A wonderful story. So the podcast, I really encourage you to go to those. While you're driving up and down the Ohio River, you can listen to these podcasts because they'll take you right to the site as well.
That's a great recommendation. Thank you so much, Nancy, for your scholarship on this and for sharing with us tonight. I'd like to thank all of our participants tonight for attending tonight's program. Thank you especially again to Nancy for sharing her expertise and insight into this important historic movement. We'd also like to thank our generous sponsor, Ohio Humanities. Ohio Humanities is a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. In the chat are the links where you can buy a copy of A Tour on the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River. This is a very interesting and useful book as it contains both history and a tour guide for you to look at the historical sites along the Ohio River. Thank you very much for attending our Ohio Book Talk series, where we feature Ohio authors discussing different eras of Ohio history. You can find more info about us on our website at buckeyebookfair.org. And we thank you again and hope you all have a great evening.